welcome to The Middle. I'm Jeremy Hobson, along with our house DJ, Tolliver. And Tolliver, before we get to our topic this hour, which is remote work versus in-person work, we do have some big news here at The Middle. First off, this Sunday, we are partnering with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation to bring you a 2-hour special looking at Donald Trump's push to make Canada the 51st state. It's going to be live across the U.S. and Canada.
I actually heard some Canadians have been boycotting travel to the U.S.
Yes.
So are they coming to you? You coming to them?
I'm going to them just in case they wanted to boycott. We're going to be doing it from beautiful Vancouver, and that show will be in our podcast feed if you miss it live. But the other thing I wanted to talk about is the fact that because of all the news that's been happening with the Trump administration, we're launching a new weekly podcast bonus episode. It's called One Thing Trump Did, that will be about
One Thing Trump Did.
That's right. It's going to be about one thing Trump did. We're going to focus on one thing every week, and you can only get that by subscribing to The Middle as a podcast in partnership with iHeart Podcasts on the iHeart app or wherever you get your podcasts. So, Tolliver, sometimes you and I are in different places, and sometimes we're sitting right next to each other. In fact, because of modern technology, this entire show team is remote, spread across 4 states in 3 time zones. Remote work is, of course, something that many Americans got used to during the COVID pandemic, and a lot of them liked it. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, before the pandemic, about 5% of Americans worked from home. In the heat of it, about half of us did. And in 2023, we were down to about 20% working remotely. Now, it is bound to be even lower than that, in part because President Trump has threatened to fire federal workers who don't return to the office full time.
Nobody's going to work from home. They're going to be going out. They're going to play tennis. They're going to play golf. They're going to do a lot of things. They're not working. It's a rare person that's going to work. You might work 10% of the time, maybe 20%. I don't think you're going to work a lot more than that.
He famously never plays golf.
That's his view. I don't play golf. We do want to hear from you, whether you're an employee or an employer. Which is better? Which is more productive? Remote or in-person work? Tolliver, can you give the phone number, please?
Yeah, it's 8444-MIDDLE. That's 844-464-3353. Or you can write to us at listentothemiddle.com, and you can also comment on our live stream on YouTube, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitch.
Let's meet our panel. Rose Horowitch is a staff writer for The Atlantic who has covered this topic. Rose, great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk about this.
It's great to have you. And Kourtny Garrett joins us as well. She's president and CEO of the Downtown Denver Partnership. Kourtny, welcome to you.
Thrilled to be here. Thanks so much.
So before we go to the phones, Rose, you've reported that a number of big companies, including Amazon, Walmart, have decided they want their workers back in the office. What is their reasoning for that? Why do they want that?
So I think their reasoning is really twofold. So one is there are a number of studies that find that, people are more creative when they're able to collaborate in person, and that, younger workers specifically, as they're getting trained, they get a lot more feedback when they can work in person and can be with their managers. So there is, some data supporting the view that having people in person does facilitate that. And then another thing that came up a lot in my reporting was just this term called executive nostalgia, which is just a lot of these, leaders came of age in a time when people were entirely working in person. And so they often have very fond memories of that. It's really worked for them, and they might enjoy the experience of being in the office a lot. So that could also be factoring into their thinking.
And what about companies like Spotify, which put an ad up in Times Square that said, quote, "Our employees aren't children. Spotify will continue working remotely." How do they justify doing something like that?
Well, the data on productivity when people work in person or remote is quite mixed. So there's a lot of, you can sort of find different data to support any view. But the consensus among, the researchers that I spoke to was that, hybrid work or, in-person work, the advantages of that are that your employees tend to be happier, they tend to stay at the company for longer, so you avoid sort of the costly having to find new
Training them and
employees.
stuff like that. Yeah.
Yes, so there are real advantages to that as well.
Kourtny, you're with the Downtown Denver Partnership. A lot of cities have had a hard time adjusting to remote work because it definitely hurts the economies of city centers. What kind of an impact has remote work had in Denver?
Yeah. Well, when we think about return to work, of course, we are a business-based organization. So we do hear and talk to our members and the companies about the corporate impact, right? From a larger scale, we're looking at return to office in terms of its impact on the city overall.
Mhm.
We're thinking about the economic impact. We're thinking about the cultural impact, the sheer operations. We talk about government coming back to work, and there's a really important segment there when you're trying to go pull a permit to improve your house, right? So those types of impacts are what we look at. So what we've seen here in Denver is a significant shift in the overall economy. And some of these things were already starting pre-pandemic. So, don't think
Don't
that we
blame everything on remote work.
I'm sorry.
Don't blame everything on remote work, you're saying. Some of
Right.
it's
Yeah.
important.
So some of these trends, when we started to see commercial office contraction, when we start to see companies like law firms taking smaller footprints, a lot of that was already starting in downtowns across the country and here in Denver to emerge. But suddenly this accelerator was hit. And there is a circumstance when you think about downtowns like Denver, we had 110,000 employees in downtown in 2020 prior to, every city was kind of around that first week in March, right? So the official shutdown day. When you lose that kind of a daytime population in such a short amount of time, then of course your economy, your environment, everything is going to shift dramatically. I was actually in Dallas at the time. I'm about 3 years into my role here, and exactly the same circumstance. We watched people walk down Main Street with their computer monitors in their hand.
And when you walk into the office buildings in Denver right now, how full are they?
We're sitting in an overall vacancy rate in downtown of 27%, which is a record high for Denver. And it's about 7 percentage points above the national average. That being said, it varies. And what's interesting, and I hope that we're able to talk about a little bit, is where we see the biggest distress. And again, this is true of my colleagues across the country, are in older office buildings that aren't necessarily historic, but they're kind of that 70s and 80s office stock that the cool tech firms and the companies that are staying and coming in, there just aren't amenities. There's not that common space that people are seeking now. So there's sort of these obsolete buildings. And in the areas that we do have more entertainment, more restaurant options, more for employees to do, we see a higher return to office rate.
Let's get to the phones because they are lighting up. And Ryan is joining us from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Ryan, welcome to the middle. What do you think about remote versus in-person work?
Hey, good evening. I'm much in favor of in-person. I taught online for a year and a half during the pandemic, and that was a very torturous experience for myself and my students. I'd just like to ask your panel their thoughts on how this question impacts the questions being had in education. An increasing number of educators are saying 5 days a week in the classroom is just not cutting it anymore. It's not necessary. But it was obvious from the pandemic that 5 days a week online is detrimental to student mental health and their socialization. So there's this debate about bringing in a hybrid model in schools. What does your panel think about, if some of the schools, started saying, hey, half the week will be online, half will be in person? Because there's going to be a lot of working people who are going to be like, wait a minute, like, do I need to stay home with my kids if they're not at school?
Yeah,
I think this impacts
good
more
question, Ryan. Let me
work.
take that to Rose Horowitz. Rose, did you see comparisons between school and office in your reporting?
So that didn't directly come up in my reporting. I didn't hear too much about it. The possibility that schools might go hybrid. That would certainly cause the issues that you bring up, that, some parents might be working and
Right.
then would need to arrange childcare. So I didn't find too much about that.
What about you, Kourtny? Did that have you thought about that and how much what the schools are doing impacts what needs to happen in the office space?
I can tell you it's very significant. We ended up losing a lot of childcare centers here in downtown Denver during the pandemic, and that's been one of the greatest barriers reported to us and employees coming back to the office, in that childcare options are incredibly limited here now. So we definitely hear that. We also, in downtown Denver, we have the Auraria Campus for Higher Education, which is a cooperative campus of 4 universities, about 42,000 students. And I can tell you the reports that we hear from that campus in terms terms of overall mental health and the challenges that they've had and success rates of graduation have been impacted through all of this. And then, of course, I have to layer in as a mother of 13-year-old twins. The challenges that you face in learning and not being in person is pretty significant, but really, really good question.
Let me just squeeze in a call before a break here. Bridget is in Columbia, South Carolina. Bridget, what do you think?
Yeah, I am all for remote work, actually. So totally other side of that coin. But I work in UX UI design, which, creative field. I know that it was talked about a little bit about how that creativity might be limited, not working in person. But I found that working remotely just opened up so many freedoms, as an individual while working that are just not accessible if you're working in person. And I think that, like, quality of life wise, it just improves so much. And I can imagine that it probably saves companies a good amount of money not to have a physical space that they have to keep for employees to be at. So I'm all for remote work personally.
Great point about the real estate. Bridget, thank you for calling. Again, our number is 844-4-MIDDLE. That's 844-464-3353. Tolliver, I am old enough to remember 5 years ago when everyone was touting the benefits, like Bridget there, of remote work, including CEOs.
Yeah, including Mark Zuckerberg. Although maybe he was just trying to get us in the metaverse. Think about it, man. Conspiracies. Here he is on CNBC back in 2020.
This overall will, I think, help spread economic opportunity more broadly across the country. There's environmental positive aspects. People are going to spend a lot less time commuting and more time just teleporting in, either over video chat or eventually things like virtual reality. I just kind of feel like moving in a more remote direction and requiring our employees to rely on these tools more will help advance some of that future technology development as well.
Teleporting.
That was then, by the way. As of September 2023, Meta's remote work policy tightened up a bit. They now require employees who are assigned to an office, because not everybody is assigned to an office, to be physically present for 3 days a week. Tolliver, what are we listening to here?
This is Kool Mo D. This is a song called I Go to Work. He had like a lot of beefs during his career, but none more passionate than his beef with commuting. More of your calls coming up on The Middle.
This is The Middle. I'm Jeremy Hobson. If you're just tuning in, The Middle is a national call-in show. We're focused on elevating voices from the middle, geographically, politically, and philosophically, or maybe you just want to meet in the middle. This hour, we're asking you for your thoughts on remote versus in-person work. Which do you prefer? Which is more productive? Tolliver, what is the number to call in?
It's 844-4-MIDDLE. That's 844-464-3353. You can also write to us at listentothemiddle.com or on social media. Jeremy, I had a hit TikTok. Did you see it this week?
I always see your hit TikToks. Yes, but only you, because I don't look at anything else except for your TikTok, so I can stay off of TikTok. I am joined this hour by Atlantic staff writer Rose Horowitch and Kourtny Garrett, CEO of the Downtown Denver Partnership. Before we go back to the phones, Rose, President Trump, in calling federal workers back to the office, has said he thinks, as we heard, people only work 20% of the time from home. What do we know really about the productivity of people when they are working at home?
We know that it tends to be pretty similar to the productivity of people when they're in the office. Potentially a slight decline, but people tend to save about 70 minutes, I think, is the average on commuting time if they're working from home. So they do tend to put some of that time back in to work. So certainly nothing like the dramatic drops of down to 20% is showing up in the data.
And what about the idea, and you mentioned this a bit earlier, of the innovation that occurs when there's collaboration? You look at places like MIT. They design buildings so that people run into each other so that there's more innovation and collaboration. Isn't there something to that?
So I think that's definitely a trade-off. And certainly, the CEOs that I spoke to and, that we often hear speaking publicly, like Jamie Dimon, are very in favor of return to office because it is much easier to collaborate. It is much easier to give feedback and train workers. And, they can wash over people and know that they are really putting in, that full day's work. So it's just sort of a trade-off because workers on average, one study shows that they would take 40% of people would take a 5% pay cut to be able to work remote. And so, it's kind of all a balancing act knowing, yeah. the differences in what people
Kind
want.
of amazing that the
Yeah.
people say that they would take a pay cut to work remote, but it makes sense because for some that's a raise in itself. Kourtny, is the infrastructure there to handle everyone working in the office? We're already hearing stories that there aren't enough spaces in these federal office buildings for all the people that President Trump has called in to work to actually work in. And some would say that our roads, our public transit is not sufficient for everyone to be commuting into the office.
Yeah, I have to tell you, I find that pretty hard to believe when we're facing the kind of vacancy rates that we are in every city. I mean, every major downtown across the country has significant vacancy rates. And in fact, there's an example here in Denver where we have a significant amount of office space that's recently been leased by the city and county of Denver because they have another building that's going under construction. So we're filling office space in that way. And I think from an infrastructure perspective, we were doing it before, right? And I think that's another thing when we look at these trends that were already there that have just been amplified and sort of taken to the extreme. Remote work was there pre-pandemic. We look at our numbers and our workforce here in downtown Denver, and really 60 to 75% of the jobs in downtown Denver before the pandemic were fully in person. We're a heavy tech-driven sector, so that tends from an industry perspective to be much more of a remote-based job. So I think that might be a misnomer, in my opinion, that's a barrier.
Well, and we know that Spirit of Halloween always manages to find space to put their stores in
I want to
every
work
year
remote for
in
Spirit
cities
Halloween.
across the country. Let's go back to the phones. And Annie is in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Hi, Annie. What do you think about remote versus in-person work?
Definitely back to the office.
Why?
I am a spouse of an employee who is working at home. Many days at the golf course and other outside activities. The weather is bad. There's the inside range. And if they're not out, they're constantly eating. Constantly eating. Please, back to the office.
So just get out of my way, go back to the office so you don't bother me, is what you're saying.
Well, not necessarily, because when he's out on the golf course, he's not bothering me. But I'm just not seeing much work being done.
Can you
And I
tell
hope
me
he's
what
not
industry he is in, Annie? You don't have to tell me the company, but what
Sales.
industry?
Sales.
Okay. Annie,
Maybe make a couple of sales calls 5 minutes in the morning, and then he's out of the house.
Yeah. Annie,
that's
thank
the
you very
life.
much for that. Rose Horowitz, that actually brings up another thing, which is something that President Trump said about people who work from home, is that they may have another job. Now, I happen to know somebody who works from home and also has a side job. It's not a full-time side job, but I'm sure that his main employer doesn't know that he has a side job.
And that is definitely, I mean, I think that's the cause of the concern on the CEO side. And we did see, I think, golfing rates go up, since people have
Golfing rates.
been working from home. So it is this real, like, we still have not reached an equilibrium or a settling point. Like, there's still this huge divide where CEOs, tend to think that people really aren't getting things done at home and want them to be in the office. And, we hear from many workers who want to be, able to work fully remote and flexible.
Wes is calling from Colorado. Wes, what do you think about remote versus in person?
Hi. The angle I haven't heard yet is office gossip. When my wife and we both work from home, when we've got someone to complain about at work, we don't do it to another employee. We don't bring down office morale. We talk to each other, take a little time throughout the day.
And that is helpful to you as an employee. You've got to have somebody to get that off your chest with.
Or like our last call,
I
you
gotta
gossip
get it
about
off
your
my-
husband.
Yeah, we'll gossip a little bit and then back to work, and then I don't have to bring down morale among my coworkers, complaining about other coworkers.
And Wes, do either you or your spouse have any pressure right now to go back to the office to work?
No, neither of us.
Interesting. Thank you for that call. One of the things, Kourtny, that started during the pandemic, or really started to get used in a big way during the pandemic, is these chat interfaces where people did do a lot of gossip, like Slack, which some people thought was a good thing, some not so good. But it's not an insignificant point that Wes is making about being able to talk to somebody about just sort of the chatter that goes on in an office in a normal situation and how it changes when people are working remotely.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of equate that to, again, with our interest in downtowns and city centers, and we call it the serendipity. And you kind of referred to it related to some of these really intentionally planned corporate campuses where you're designing these interactions that you have with people. So whether it's to gossip or to create some business development or make a deal over coffee. Our interest in really providing that environment in a downtown setting is that you have a multitude of employees and corporations and businesses that are interacting on a regular basis. And you have these serendipitous moments of interaction in public space and in the in-betweens in such a dense environment. So we really feel strongly that that's still a significant asset for our downtowns that we can amplify.
You know, Rose, actually, I remember doing a story many years ago as a business reporter about the tunnel that was supposed to be built going into New York City from New Jersey that Chris Christie, the governor at the time, pulled the state funding for. And I interviewed an economist who said the reason everybody wants to be in New York is because your lawyer is right here and your advertising person is right here and your marketing person is right here and everybody gets to interact with each other. And that's why it has the most dynamic economy in the world. I wonder how you think that connects to just any office being in person and being able to interact with people.
I definitely think that there is, an important element to that, particularly if it's a job where you're really trying to be, more creative, and come up with, real innovative ideas. It can definitely be helpful to run into people. But at the same time, it's interesting talking about office gossip. I spoke with one person who worked at Amazon who, was talking about how they have a real open office plan, and it was just so loud that it was so much harder for him to get things done, when they are in person. So there definitely is an element of kind of reducing distractions. And, studies show that for call center employees, it actually is, they tend to be more productive at home because you're not constantly hearing everything going on around you.
I actually have some web comments related to you. About to cut to me. Look at that. Eric in Indianapolis says, I worked in a cubicle farm for 31 years. As I got older, it got harder and harder to concentrate with a person yapping nearby. I found the pandemic to be refreshing. I gave up a 40-mile drive, parking fees, or more time for myself for self-care. 40 miles, okay? That's interstate. Lucas in Champaign says, I think it's absurd for a guy, President Trump, who spends a quarter of his time golfing and a large percentage of his remaining time working from his personal residence instead of the White House to be casting aspersions at any of the workers in this country. Ooh, fighting words.
You can write in at listentothemiddle.com or you can call us at 844-464-3353. I do want to hear this hour from a boss. If you're out there and you want to make the case one way or the other, I'd love to hear from you. And let's go to Danelle, who's in Eastern Texas. Danelle, welcome to the middle. Go ahead.
Hi, how are you? Well, I have a little bit different perspective. I am an independent artist. And I had to start taking care of my mother around the beginning of the pandemic because she's bedridden. And so I set up my pottery studio to where I can take care of her and we don't have to pay for someone to come and be a caregiver, because that at about, $30 an hour for the lowest cost is about $600 a day if you are looking at, in office hours. And I have a friend who was in marketing, and they asked her, she's in a similar situation. She's taking care of a parent who's bedridden, and she had to quit her job because she could not afford the cost of having someone at home while she is in the office. And I think that when so many people are struggling just to pay their bills, for the president to say people are going to spend their time doing leisure sports activities, he's not speaking to the general populace in the country. He's speaking to the elite, because I've never played golf in my life, mostly because I don't really want to, but I really don't understand, if someone is able to, like if you're working at home independently, you don't have the productivity that unless you have that determination. And people wouldn't keep their jobs if they weren't putting out the required job necessities. And if they're in the office and they're spending time in the office doesn't mean that they're doing a better job.
Yeah.
I think
Then
they're probably, it depends on how
let me take that
dedicated
over
they are.
to Kourtny, because you bring up an interesting point. And the one thing that stands out to me there, Kourtny, is it's not one size fits all. Are there industries that you're saying should come back in, and there are some that just don't make sense after the pandemic to come back into downtown Denver and fill up those office spaces?
I think you can look at it from an industry perspective, who's predisposed, and look at individual circumstance, right? So this isn't necessarily a wholly one side or the other issue. Again, I point back to trends pre-pandemic and work flexibility. I remember even when I was younger, with my mom had Flex Fridays as an accountant for a defense company, right? So this is not a brand new notion. I think it's more of a culture within companies to understand and embrace the flexibility while also ensuring productivity and ensuring that the office environment, whatever that office environment is, suits the business. And we do advocate for the impact of this on cities to be a factor in these decisions. I think it also begs the question that our industry asks a lot is who and what are our center cities for? And what is, it's this quintessential question of what will downtowns be, or big commercial office centers. And I think it gives us this opportunity to think about neighborhood amenities, to think about building more density, to be more like New York, where you have these multidimensional environments that suit lifestyles, right? If you're living close to your dry cleaner, close to your, what we were talking about earlier, close to your grocery store, it makes it easier to care for an ailing parent.
This is why I wanted to have you on this show this hour, because I think this is such an important part of this discussion. Is the lack of workers in offices has made a huge difference in cities around the country, which has caused all kinds of other issues. Let's go to Charles, who's in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Charles, welcome to the middle. Your thoughts on remote versus in-person work?
Well, this is tangential, but I'm wondering how much it relates to the national epidemic of loneliness. When I worked in an office, I'm retired, but when I worked in a building with a lot of people, we would all get together on Friday afternoon after work and have some drinks. Or we'd get together and plan on going to a ball game together, that sort of thing. And I think now, with everybody's, because the loneliness epidemic is not just young teenage girls, although maybe being underfoot of their parents is adding to that. I don't know, but I think they're linked, and I'm curious as how you guys feel.
Yeah, great point, Charles. Rose Horowitch, what do you think about that? I was thinking also about how it might connect to our phone addiction, because we have to spend so much time on screens because many of us are remote. But what about loneliness?
I think there's definitely something to that. If you think back, the office sort of used to be the locus of, a lot of people found kind of relationships there, friendships, after work happy hours. And so I definitely think that there is an element of, it sort of forced you to be there and did, force you to engage with people. And so it certainly could be contributing to that.
And yet
those lunches were expensive, though.
They're more expensive than they were, Tolliver. That is for sure now. And yet, Kourtny, people don't want to go back to the office. Like if you were to poll workers, they would probably, I bet more than half would say, I'd rather keep on working at home.
Yeah, it's really fascinating is we've looked at things right when the pandemic started from an urban planning perspective. The notion of third places came to being, and that's not third place ranking. That is the notion of spaces where you go, that's not your home and it's not your office, but you go to work, you go to have those serendipitous encounters. So we focused a lot of our energy around parks, around open air patios to create those third places. And guess what? People are coming to those, right? So it's this fundamental sort of perception of I'm going to the office into my cubicle that I think still has that sort of intimidating factor or negative factor in a lot of psychology, when in fact, so many office redesigns, so many of our cities are building things in a new creative way.
By the way, Rose, I know when you're reporting, you're probably moving around, but how often do you actually go into the office these days?
I go in about 4 days a week.
You still do go doing 4 days a week. And is it busy at the
It,
Atlantic?
It is busy, yes. And it's an open office floor plan, so it is
Yeah.
nice to, and I'm pretty new to the job. I mean, this is something that we were discussing earlier, but when you're younger, it's definitely very helpful to be able to hear more
Right.
experienced colleagues and learn from them.
Yeah. Well, Tolliver, the idea of remote work, of course, did not start during the COVID pandemic.
No, they were throwing this idea around back in the 70s, Jeremy, when you were born. Listen to this
I was born in the 80s. Okay, go ahead.
I know. Now listen to this 1979 clip from a BBC documentary about word processors. Remember those? Yeah. I don't.
Linda English works for F International as a computer programmer. She has a modern, well-equipped kitchen, 2 children, and a bubble-memoried terminal. Linda can write and store the program she's working on at times most convenient to her, when the children are asleep or at school. When the job is done, the computer's only a phone call away. Linda is in the forefront of perhaps the biggest revolution for working mothers since the pill. The office and the home is rather like having your cake and eating it.
Okay, John.
Since the pill, that would be the birth control pill. And there you go. A reminder, The Middle is available as a podcast in partnership with iHeart Podcasts on the iHeart app or wherever you listen to podcasts. And Tolliver, what are we listening to here?
You know what it is. This is the Police with Don't Stand So Close to Me. I play this every time I take the train in Chicago, and it hasn't worked once. Okay? Never works. More of your calls coming up on The Middle.
This is The Middle. I'm Jeremy Hobson, and this hour we're asking you, is remote work better than in-person work? You can call us at 844-4MIDDLE. That's 844-464-3353. You can reach out to us at listentothemiddle.com. My guests are Atlantic staff writer Rose Horowitch and Downtown Denver Partnership CEO Kourtny Garrett. And before we go back to the phones, Rose, there has been some reporting that as companies pull people back to the office, some bosses are playing favorites, letting some workers stay remote and telling others they have to come back. What is at stake when it comes to morale and retention?
Well, definitely studies show that employee morale improves with the option to work hybrid or remote. And so there, seems to be more turnover when bosses try to pull everyone into the office. And so that's a challenge because these companies are all competing for each other with each other for workers. So, when Amazon went, back to the office 5 days a week, people were talking about how other companies could try to poach, some of their best employees. And so it's really a question like, do you try to discipline someone who's a very high performer and could leave if they'd prefer to just work from home? And the data that we do have suggests that companies are not going to do that, and they'll just let someone work from home if they're doing a good job.
Rather than lose them. Let's go to the phones. Nathan is in Tampa, Florida. Nathan, welcome to The Middle. Go ahead.
Hey, how's it going? I got to watch my levels. Apparently, I'm too loud for radio.
You sound great. Go ahead.
Okay, cool. I'm just going to address the loneliness thing. Don't worry about that. Tesla had his best friend was a pigeon, and he was all right. So we don't really need to worry about the loneliness thing. But back to my reason for calling is I worked as a gig worker during, the shutdown when everybody was working at home. It was great. Gas prices were low. It wasn't Mad Max driving around because that's how it is in Florida most of the time. It was wonderful.
So you prefer when people are not working in the office as a gig worker, as a driver?
Stay home if you can.
It's an interesting perspective, Kourtny. You're talking about trying to get everybody back in, but somebody like him, they want people to be at home. They get more business, I guess, delivering stuff and taking people around.
I mean, I guess there's something to be said for a quiet city and the ease in which it makes. But, that, again, it goes back to the overall impact on cities. And when you see empty streets and patrons not being able to, speaking to the gig economy, I mean, thank goodness during COVID, we were able to adapt and use Uber Eats and DoorDash and all of these to support our restaurants, because that was one of our greatest challenges as an organization and an industry, is the number of small businesses that were lost. So you, again, extract that population and businesses suffer.
Yeah. Let's go to Mike in Houston. Mike, welcome to The Middle. Your thoughts on remote versus in person?
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. Mine's more of just kind of a commentary, and that's funny that she was just speaking to restaurants because I am a ex-chef that pulled off during the pandemic, and I'm actually at a drive-through right now.
Okay, well, focus on us.
Thank
You make them wait. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate it. You too. I apologize. It was more so just a commentary on the mandate to come back to the office is just more or less employers mandating to us that we do kind of what they ask us to do, which is all fine and good. But at some point, I feel like we're going to have a serious conversation about what we're employed, what we are offered as employees, whether our job is tied to our insurance, whether we have the ability to work from home, what choices that we actually have. A lot of these decisions seem to be being made really without our input. And I feel like at some point that's going to have to change. I don't know how or when, but it was more so just a commentary about
that. It's a really interesting point, Mike. And I want to say that, the fact that he was going through a drive-through is nothing compared to the fact that we had a stripper call in last week. But fresh off
pulled
work,
over. Remember
somebody who got pulled over. Okay, but what about that point, Rose? That companies are making these decisions, and in the case of President Trump, is certainly making this decision without consulting with the workers in the federal government who are now being forced to change their lives and go back to the office.
Well, I think a lot of this, because there is such distance, generally between where company leaders are and where their employees are, we're sort of it basically just depends on who has the power at the moment, kind of in the broader economy. And so, if it's a very strong job market and, employees can sort of choose where to go, then they're going to be the ones to more have the power. But, if they are feeling like they really need to stay where they are, then employers, will kind of seize that power when, it's a worse like kind of outlook for employees.
Kourtny, what do you tell employers when you're saying to them, we want you to come back, we want you to get your workers back in here because it's going to be good for the city? What do you say to them about how they can convince their employees that it's a good idea for them too? Is there a good way to make that case to an employee who doesn't really want to go back into the office?
It comes down in our minds to the overall environment. And by no means do we think that this existential sort of banging of our fists to say, bring your employees back, is necessarily at that extreme going to A, be successful, and B, the right thing to do. But we wholly believe that the environment of a downtown, a thriving downtown, is very conducive to business growth and to overall employee well-being. And we hear that and see that time and time again in psychology and overall just a lot of the return to office studies that we've done. So our persuasion and really working with employers just to say, we are building an incredible environment that is full and rich with amenities that will make your employees want to be here.
Teresa is calling from Hudson, Wisconsin. Teresa, what do you think about this?
I don't think it's my responsibility to go and fund a downtown economy when I barely have the means to fund my own life. I feel like cities should pivot and they should work together instead of mandating people come back into the office. And not every office building is up to date or, has all the amenities. That costs money that a lot of companies don't have to invest in.
What do you mean cities should pivot? How did they pivot with all that space downtown? How did they pivot with all the restaurants and the businesses that are supported by the workers?
I feel like, the DoorDash, the Uber Eats, food trucks, delivery services, that was great during COVID. And I think, and it cuts down on traffic. My commute to work is a lot faster. It's just, I feel like working from home or a hybrid of maybe 3 days a week is ideal.
Do you worry, though, Teresa, about empty cities and the things that happen when cities are empty?
No, because people still need to go get groceries. They still need to go buy clothes. It's not like these businesses are going to die without our foot traffic during the day.
Teresa, thank you. I'm going to let you respond to that, Kourtny, because that was a direct attack.
I know, I'm dying
you.
to. I'm dying to. No, actually, it's quite the contrary. In a lot of ways, I agree with what Teresa's saying. And it goes back to this fundamental question of what what are downtowns, who are they for, and how has this fundamentally changed? And I think if we wholly rest on commercial office as being the driver for downtowns, particularly those that have been historically driven by commercial office, then we are absolutely going to miss the mark, and we will see a type of depression that we haven't seen in this country in our downtowns in well over a century. So we have to recognize this change. So I think back to the late 90s with, and I think it was Richard Florida that first started talking about the Friends impact when we started talking about bringing more residential to our downtowns. So again, New York, San Francisco, coastal cities like that aside, most of our American downtowns have been driven by commercial office as the primary industry use. And so this shift that we've wanted to live in our downtowns, to have our grocery stores in our downtowns, to have more of the well-rounded neighborhood experience has been happening for a long time. And again, we have to both bring jobs, make sure that downtowns that are economic drivers for most regions, by the way, in a really significant way, sales tax, lodgers tax, property tax, all of those things. But really recognizing the fact that, again, I actually agree that this re-envisioning and reimagining and pivot is necessary while also maintaining a really strong job center.
Let's go to Julie in St. Paul, Minnesota. Julie, welcome to the middle. Your thoughts on remote versus in-person?
Yeah, just a couple of comments. One, I would say a lot has to do with the person's position. Like I think your first caller was a teacher, and I think we have seen that. The in-person teaching has certainly, when it was remote, made such a devastating impact to the students. So I think a lot has to do with the roles. Certainly I have a lot of friends that are nurses, EMT, things like that. They definitely, it's not really an option, right? But myself, I work for a mid-sized consulting firm. I'm in St. Paul, Minnesota. My consulting firm is in Atlanta. The client that I'm working for is in New Jersey. And it is IT. So yeah, we're dispersed. My solutions architect is in California. I have two BAs. One is in Texas. One's in Pennsylvania. My boss is in North Carolina.
Right. Everybody's all over the place.
For us is, and we're able to pull this pool of really exceptional, highly quality people because it isn't we're not limited to a 20-mile radius.
Right. That's an interesting point.
I bet Minnesotans love working at home, man. I lived there for 4 years. It's negative 40 there right now.
Right.
Stay in the house.
It's cold. But Rose, it does make it easier for a CEO or a boss to hire people when they don't care where that person is.
Mhm. Yes, and in the course of my reporting, I actually spoke with the CEO of a smaller tech startup, and they were talking about how they think it's their competitive advantage to be able to, be fully remote, and that way they can get talent anywhere, and they don't have to, just say no to somebody because they don't want to relocate. And so that definitely is, a huge factor that it can be a real advantage there.
Stephen is calling from Philadelphia. Stephen, what do you think about this topic?
Hey guys, so I think in my mind, there's no one size fits all solution for everyone because everyone's different. And I'm in my 30s. I don't have kids at this point, and I'm back to the fully back to office schedule, and I sort of like it because it's easier for me to commute. I can have everyone in the office I can talk to, but at the same time, for someone who has 5 kids, it's just almost impossible for them to do the same schedule, fully back to office, and they would definitely prefer a more remote kind of working situation.
But that's really about, you're saying that's really about their personal situation, not about what their work wants them to do.
Yeah, that comes back to the employer. I think if the employer can be a little bit more flexible with different people's situation, hey, as long as they can find a solution for that to be an efficient way, so that all the employees needs being kind of taken care of, and it'll be more flexible situations if there's a solution there.
Yeah, Stephen, thanks. Kourtny, I feel like there's a little bit of a pattern here that we are hearing this hour, which is that it's not a one size fits all solution. You've said it. It's not a one size fits all solution. And maybe there is some sort of hybrid model that needs to exist in this country. And maybe that does involve people going back to the office at least some of the time, but maybe they have some flexibility depending on their personal situation and whether they're actually getting their work done.
And that's truly what we hear from our employers. I mean, we represent more than 700 downtown businesses here in Denver. And that is over and over again what we hear is this notion of flexibility. I think one of the favorite phrases that I've heard is we are a work from office culture with flexibility to fit our lifestyles and needs of our employees. So, rather than sort of the reverse, which was the narrative of we're a work from home culture, so I think we're just hearing that over and over again as the presiding vision. And whether you're coming in 3 days, 4 days, now we're seeing more and more come back 5 days. But again, that notion of an increased awareness of how flexibility benefits our employees and our culture, I think that is the biggest lesson that's come out of what we've all faced.
Which, of course, is at odds with what President Trump is doing, which is to have everybody do one thing and not sort of a case by case. Although the executive order is worded in such a way that a boss of a federal agency could say, well, you can stay remote. Let's get one more call in. Jane is in Las Vegas, Nevada. Jane, go ahead with your thoughts.
Hi, I'm actually pro office. I used to work in tech, so I used to have to come into the office, and I was privileged with a lot of desk work and computer work. And I know this is beneficial for people who have kids at home, or there's other things that keep them from coming into the office. But from my perspective, especially from a younger worker, sometimes people would just kind of do a cop out and be like, I don't want to come to the office because it's easier, more convenient for me to stay home. And it did a number on the office morale. It's kind of isolating, I actually enjoy going to the office and being able to talk to people and show up in meetings. And if you have the privilege to be able to, I think if you have the choice to be able to go to the office and socialize and see other people and people you like working with, that is the original third space that people had. And now we're kind of trying to recreate these things through coffee shops and cafes and working in libraries. And honestly, if you have a nice office and workplace, there are a number of people that won't say it out loud, but they might just not want to show up at work. And I think that kind of does a number on, just office morale and isolation.
Yeah, Jane, thanks. I know Kourtny agrees with you, but I'm going to give Rose the last word here, which, did you, in your reporting, did you hear from workers who said, I want to be in the office, just as Jane did there?
Definitely. And there definitely is a wide variety of opinions. I heard from workers who said, I like that it forces me to get out and, get ready for the day and, really get the day started. And then I talked to some CEOs who were totally in favor of remote work. So I think that we'll just have to see as we it's interesting, the percentage of people that actually work in each arrangement has stayed pretty constant since spring of 2023. There's just a lot of churn. So we'll just have to see, how it plays out.
Yeah. And now as we said, the nation's largest employer, the federal government, big in every state, is bringing everybody back. I want to thank my guest, Kourtny Garrett, CEO of the Downtown Denver Partnership, and Atlantic staff writer, Rose Horowitch. Thanks so much to both of you.
Thank you.
And again, sign up for the Middle Podcast to get our new special bonus weekly episode called One Thing Trump Did. It's going to be starting soon, and we are going to be live across the U.S. and Canada this Sunday, February 23rd, asking you what Canada as a 51st state means to you.
As always, you can call in at 8444-MIDDLE. That's 844-464-3353. Or you can reach out to listen to themiddle.com. You can also sign up for our free weekly newsletter. Don't forget to check out our new video podcast on YouTube where you can watch us, as well as hear us. Sorry I haven't shaved in a long time.
Ever. The Middle is brought to you by Long Nook Media, distributed by Illinois Public Media in Urbana, Illinois, and produced by Harrison Patino, Danny Alexander, Sam Burmistaz, John Barth, Annika Deschler, and Brandon Kondritz. Our technical director is Jason Croft. Thanks to our satellite radio listeners, our podcast audience, and the more than 420 public radio stations that are making it possible for people across the country to listen to The Middle. I'm Jeremy Hobson, and I will talk to you this weekend and again next week.